I think 2025 has potential to be one of the UFC's best years in history with what we've got going on. How I couldn't be further from the truth. Fellas, it's no surprise that the UFC in 2025 hasn't really been living up to expectations. And whose fault is this? Is it the fault of the fights themselves? Is it the fighters? No, it's the promotion itself. Dana White's treating the UFC like a side project these days. He seems more interested in boxing and other endeavors than the actual UFC. And you look at this recent situation with Alex Pereira, bearing in mind he's a megastar. He saved 2024 on at least 3 different occasions, and he's a highlight reel machine. He is the most valuable UFC fighter, or at least he was. You couldn't have asked for a better fighter on the roster. And he recently tweeted saying that, yeah, I always answer the UFC's calls, but if they want to play with me, we can do that. I've never spoken poorly of the UFC, but with what I've just heard, I'm disheartened. The fact that he tweeted that, and I know he then tweeted in saying he got hacked, but of course you did, buddy. You just got the message from Dana White telling you to delete that shit. So if the most valuable fighter in the UFC is getting undervalued by Dana White from what it seemed from that tweet, how does that make you think that Dana White's treating the rest of the roster? And this whole situation with John Jones and Tom Aspinall, no information on it. Dricus du Plessis versus Khamzat Chimaev, no information on it. Topuria versus Makhachev, we only recently just heard information on it about this JDM versus Bilal fight. I know the other super fights that we're expecting coming into 2025 seem to not really be happening, but he's happy to announce Juliana Pena as a co-main event for a pay-per-view with all smiles. And UFC 317, 51 days away, still no official main event for that card. And another concerning fact that I've just realized about how Dana White's been kind of, running the UFC recently. Look at the next 4 pay-per-views in the UFC after UFC 316. UFC 318, that's ruled off. That's going to be Holloway versus Poirier 3. UFC 320, that's likely to be a Mexico headliner because it's in Mexico. I doubt they're going to do a super fight on that, which leaves us with the 3 super fights of the year: Makhachev, Topuria, Dricus, Chimaev, and Jones and Aspinall. Let's assume that UFC 319, that's going to be Dricus versus Chimaev, and let's assume that UFC 317 is going to be Makhachev versus Topuria, depending on how the Bilal fight goes. That means this fight with John Jones versus Tom Aspinall is likely going to be in fucking November. That means 469 days have been wasted of Tom Aspinall's prime. And I know John Jones is the guy ducking. It's his fault, not necessarily the UFC's, but how many times did we tell the UFC we don't want to see the fight with Stipe Miocic? And the only guy defending that fight was Mr. Dana White himself. And there's just no big fight to look forward to right now in the UFC. I mean, we've got Bilal Muhammad versus JDM tomorrow. I'm going to tune in. It's got big implications, but it's alright. You know what I mean? It's not a super fight. Juliana Pena versus Kayla Harrison. It's rare we see rivalries in the UFC, so I guess congrats for building up the fight. But again, not a fight that I'm necessarily stoked for. But, Merab versus O'Malley 2. Really hyped for the first fight. This time, not so much, because Sean O'Malley's done absolutely nothing to deserve the rematch. And again, talk on the topic of Merab and O'Malley, nobody really wanted to see this. I mean, you look at Dana White's justification of this fight in the UFC 316 press conference. He was storing all over the place. He had nothing to say. He was lost for words to even sell a fight as a pay-per-view main event. And I can almost guarantee, rather than doing Shavkat versus the winner of Bilal and JDM, they're going to do some dumb shit like Ian Gary versus the winner, because that's the type of shit that Dana White's been doing. And you look at the next 4 cards in the UFC, it's the depression. It's the depressing state right now for UFC fans. The next 4 cards that we've got coming up in both fight nights and pay-per-views. Like, the only real good card that had everything this year, honestly, has been UFC 314. It was stacked on paper. It had a good build-up, a couple of rivalries. The card itself performed. So the UFC and Dana White know how to make a good card, and it coincidentally happens in every April. And he's been saying for a long time, as Dana White, that he's been trying to get rid of the Apex. He's trying to do more events in cities. He said this in April of 2024. So far, we've had a complete handful of Apex slop events this year. Understacked cards, no crowd in the Apex, and I don't even think it's necessarily the card. And we've kind of had to lower our standards to appreciate bad cards, but it's the Apex itself. And then we go to this whole boxing situation, which I'm going to rant over a bit. This whole TKO deal that Dana White has signed. He signed a deal with TKO and Turk Al-Shea to get into the industry of boxing. And you saw him in the face-off between Canelo and Terence Crawford. But you've got a pay-per-view next week and you're promoting boxing fights more than you've promoted the UFC. And in 2025, honestly, for a casual combat sports fan perspective, boxing's probably doing better than the UFC. And that's crazy to say if you'd have told me this a few years ago. Boxing's actually doing a lot better nowadays with big fights and big stars than the UFC is. And bearing in mind they get away with promoting these lackluster fights that, people aren't really enjoying. I mean, look at that Canelo fight that he just had last weekend. It set the record for the lowest output fight in boxing history. And then they're deving Haney fight, which was one of the worst fights they've seen in a while. And that just shows the extent of how good boxing promoters are compared to Dana White, that they can promote slop and still get away with it, where Dana White's got genuine good fights and he's still not even promoting them. And look at the promo for that Garcia versus Rolly fight. I know they could have done better, but they had a face-off, one of the funniest faces-offs if you haven't checked it out already. The press conference, which were better than the fight itself. The cinematic build-ups that they tend to do for every big boxing event. You know, just everything to do with the build-up. You look at UFC 315 and how they promoted this fight. They've got a shitty countdown episode, which sounds like David Attenborough's kind of commentating, just commentating the entire countdown. You've got a lackluster press conference that had probably one good line from Jack Della Madrid where he talked about Ian Gary. They don't even do face-to-faces anymore, which I think is a disgrace, because I think they're some of the best promo you can do for combat sports. And then, you know, you've got these mega stars in boxing like Devin Haney and Canelo. Well, I'm not going to sit here and act like Canelo's always boring, but guys who don't really perform. And you've got JDM about to fight for a belt, potentially a champion in 2 days' time, who's having to fundraise to cover his team's flights for UFC 315. Pantoja, who worked at Uber Eats just before he became the champion after facing Moreno. You've got Tom Aspinall, who's likely to go down in history as the most skilled heavyweight ever. This guy has potential to be written down in history books, and he's been kind of fading into kind of obscurity because the UFC haven't been given any fights. They've not really been treating Aspinall correctly for the past year and a half. And that's the difference between the UFC and boxing. Boxing takes boring fighters and turns them into superstar pay-per-view guys that are getting paid millions of dollars. The UFC is the opposite. They've got a fun roster full of fun fights, and they just half-ass it. They half-ass it. They don't really put any effort into making these fights or giving these fighters good opportunities. And in 2021, if you'd have talked about boxing, you'd have called boxing a clown show. It's a clown show. Influencers are carrying this sport, and the UFC is the best versus the best. And then Turk Al-Shea comes into the organization, or just the sport in general, saves boxing. And now in 2025, the whole narrative is that boxing's alive again, and the UFC just not delivering. We need Turk Al-Shea to come over to the UFC and do the same thing, because Dana White isn't doing his job. The last thing we need is the CEO of the UFC, or the guy that, you know, the front runner of the UFC, going over to Turk Al-Shea to sign a TKO deal and leaving the UFC. Look at Dana's energy when he's hosting a boxing match and then a press conference. He seems completely uninterested in every single press conference he attends. He cuts it short as well. And that's why we've had multiple massive boxing fights this year, and we're only in April. And in the UFC, we've had 2 maybe good pay-per-views, UFC 314 and UFC 311, and that's counting pay-per-views that have been announced as well. And Eddie Hearn went out and said that there's not really any big stars in MMA nowadays, and a lot of people give him criticism for that, but he's kind of right. I mean, who have you really got? Alex Pereira, he's just lost the belt to Ankalaev. I guarantee he's not going to be here in 2 years' time. Sean O'Malley, the biggest manufactured star the UFC has seen, again coming off a title loss, been manufactured into another title fight. Ilya Topuria, who's been inactive since October. I know it's not necessarily his fault, but you're really kind of struggling with stars. And for example, the UFC can make good fights. This fight that we've recently done with Marvin Vettori and Brendan Allen for UFC 318, that's a good fight. You know, they've got a bit of a rivalry there. A lot of fans were asking for that fight. So the matchmaking's good, even though it probably should have been a fight night main event to give that fight more spotlight. That's the type of main event you need to be doing for fight nights, not, you know, Macy Barber versus Erin Blanchfield. They should do a face-to-face for this. Perfect opportunity, you know, to build a fight. They could have done it for a fight night main event. 2 guys that dislike each other, but I can guarantee they're not going to do that because the UFC, I don't even know why they don't do it. It's almost self-sacrifice at this point. But then we've got Blanchfield and Barber as a main event instead. Oh, I can guarantee you guys can't wait for Blanchfield versus Barber, card of the year.
It's because we're finally going to see the prospects get tested. We've still a lot of breakthrough prospects in 2024.
Now, to be fair, I will admit, the UFC have done a good job at pushing these prospects this year. We've seen many different prospects get tested. We've seen many prospects lose. So I'll say on the UFC's behalf, they've done a good job at pushing prospects this year. A couple of main events for some of them. So I'll give them that.
This could potentially be the greatest year of contender fights in the entirety of the UFC.
I was wrong about that too. I mean, look at the welterweight division, for example. You've got Bilal Muhammad and JDM fighting for the belt. You've got Shavkat at number 1 in the division. You've also got Sean Brady, who can make a case to be a top contender. You've also got Ian Gary, who's demanding that he fights for a belt. I might make a video on this, that he's demanding that he gets the next title shot in the welterweight division. And then you've also got Buckley and Usman on top of that. You've got a logjam of contenders in the welterweight division. Even at 155, where I talked about the fact that 155 could have been the greatest year for contenders this year. year. Rafael Fiziev, he just lost a rematch to Gaethje. Talks of him moving down to 145 after the Bahamondes fight. Dan Hooker's been injured again. He's probably going to be out for half a year. Yoel Alvarez, he's just been injured again, and he's probably going to be moving to a welterweight in his next fight. Renato Moicano had a short notice fight against Makhachev where he couldn't really showcase his skills, and now he's probably going to be out for quite some time. We have got some good fights though, you know, Holloway versus Poirier 3. I'm looking forward to that, and there is still some top contenders at 155 that, you know, could be good in putting good matchups, even though the likes of Oliver and Gaethje demanding title fights. And you've got Islam Makhachev, who's probably going to be moving up to 170 if JDM beats Bilal. So there's still a bit of an issue with top contenders, and I definitely wouldn't call it the greatest year of contender fights in UFC history.
His cards are finally starting to become stacked again in the UFC.
We had hope. I had hope for a minute. That hope obviously didn't live up to potential. You look at the next couple of UFC cards we've got and the past couple of UFC cards, I'd say the only stacked card we had, like proper stacked if we're not trying to lower our standards, was UFC 314. Maybe UFC Kansas City for a fight night was stacked as well, but the rest of the cards we've had haven't been stacked, and I blame the UFC for this. I blame Dana White. I blame the promotion, because they're just not living up to the potential that the UFC could have been. And I stand by what I said at the beginning a couple of months ago, that 2025 did have potential to be one of the UFC's best years, and they've just not living up to that. They've just not lived up to it. They've had all the opportunities, they've had the resources, they've had the super fights, they've had the fighters willing to fight, they've had everything, and they've fumbled it. So that's just a little rant on Dana White and the fact that he's completely kind of self-sacrificed and just pushed the UFC to, you know, aside this year. So let me know your thoughts on this. If you agree with what I've said in this video, if you think 2025 did have potential and it kind of didn't reach that, just let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.